Well, good evening, everybody. And what a wonderful evening this is going to be. We are so privileged to be able to host the book launch of Rupert's latest book, The Science Delusion. It is a great honor for the network to be able to do this. I'm president of the Scientific and Medical Network. And as you all may know, this is being streamed. So welcome to those who are seeing us on stream, and welcome to you all who are in the hall. Now, the Medical and Scientific Network has a journal called the Network Review, and it is an organization that examines science and in a critical and open way. We are enormously interested in the progress of science and what it does, and to this end, we give a number of conferences. The conferences we're giving this year are The Mystery of Consciousness and Western Meditation Traditions, Mapping Time, Mind and Space, and The Body and Beyond, which is another one of ours, The Science and Spiritual Perspectives on the Subtle Body. So you can see we cover a number of topics. Now, this evening, I'll just go into the organization. Unfortunately, we can't take money in Kings. Those of you who want to buy books might be quite relieved at this, but I don't think Rupert will. So any of you who want to buy a book, and Rupert is very happy to sign them, could you please get a label and give your name and address to Claudia? The label will be Claudia's address, and you can send the money to her. So give your name and address, get a label, and then you can send the money to Claudia. After the presentation and the questions, there will be some drinks and some nibbles at the back there for people who would like them. We hope that the formal presentations and questions will end at about 10 to 9, and then there will be drinks. So let me start the formal proceedings by welcoming Rupert Sheldrake here. Rupert is a most amazing person. I've known him now for a number of years. He is highly intelligent and enormously creative. He studied biochemistry at Cambridge and then won the Frank Knox Fellowship in the Graduate School at Harvard, where he studied the history and philosophy of science. Very lucky to study the history and philosophy of science so early in your career. Many of my colleagues never ever studied it, and some who didn't do it until they were in their mid-50s. That was me too. He returned to Cambridge and did a PhD on the development of plants. His PhD was innovative and constructive. He found dying cells played a major part in the regulation of plant growth, and most particularly was well in advance of the field which subsequently developed in the recognition of programmed cell death and the way that cell death contributes to the development of other cells. After his PhD, he was elected as a research fellow at Clare College, Cambridge, and was director of studies in cell biology and biochemistry. Now, one of the interesting things about creative people is that they're creative from the start. When I was at Trinity, in a supervision with Andrew Huxley, one of my friends asked Andrew, "Tell me, do some people develop late?" And Andrew looked at him and said, "Afraid not, no." Well, you can see, in fact, this is absolutely true in Rupert's case, because he was brilliant from the beginning. He was then appointed a research fellow of the Royal Society and continued his research on plants in Cambridge. The Royal Society funded a year at the University of Malaya, where he studied rainforests and rubber trees. He returned to Cambridge and developed a new hypothesis relating to the aging of animal plants and humans, publishing a large number of papers, including several in Nature, which, as you know, is the real mark of a scientist. He then left Cambridge to do practical research in India for the benefit of some of the world's poorest people. So you can see not only is he a highly intelligent, progressive and successful scientist, he's also a wonderful human being. Now I'm telling you all this so that you can see that Rupert's scientific knowledge and background are impeccable. He has shown in all his work a spirit of true scientific inquiry, questioning any assumptions and using the scientific method rigorously. In 1981, which is a long time ago now, he published A New Science of Life, in which he proposed his hypothesis of form-shaping fields called morphogenetic fields. These fields had inherent memory given by morphic resonance. This book was not received well by the orthodox scientific community, and John Maddox, the editor of Nature, said with liberal open-mindedness in an ill-judged statement, which did his eventual reputation far more damage than Rupert's, this was a book for burning. Astonishing. Since then, Rupert has continued to press the scientific boundaries in the most creative and original way, investigating the interconnectedness of mind through animal and human telepathy. He's also continued to develop his theory of morphic resonance, finding new examples, and these were given an updated New Science of Life published in 2009. This work perhaps has inevitably brought him into almost continual conflict with members of the scientific establishment who feel threatened and uncomfortable when their basic beliefs are challenged. Rupert, however, is a skilled debater. When dealing with entrenched prejudice of materialistic science, always knows the facts better than his opponents, and is able to point out their deficiencies rather more effectively than they can point out his. The standard of debate he sometimes has to deal with is epitomized by one occasion when a critic was forced to confess that he hadn't actually bothered to read the paper he was criticizing, as he knew it was rubbish. Over the last few years, Rupert's experience of the Church of Scientific Materialism has expanded, and so we come to his most recent book, The Science Delusion, Freeing the Spirit of Enquiry, in which he looks at 10 standard assumptions of materialistic science and asks what would happen if these assumptions were not accepted as an act of faith, but truly questioned in an open spirit of scientific examination. The interest this has aroused can be seen by the fact that the first printing sold out within 2 days of publication. So we are very privileged and honored to be able to welcome Rupert Sheldrake at the launch of his new book. Rupert Sheldrake.
Well, thank you, Peter, for that generous introduction. And I'm very pleased that the first time I'm talking about this book, I'm doing so in the Scientific and Medical Network, which has been like a kind of home base for me in England ever since it was started. The science delusion is the belief that science already understands the nature of reality in principle, leaving only the details to be filled in. And this is a belief that's extremely widely diffused in our society, and it's been exported to the rest of the world. It's based on the so-called scientific worldview, which is essentially that all reality is material or physical, that the world is a kind of machine made up of unconscious matter, that nature is purposeless, that mental activity, consciousness, is nothing but the activity of the brain, and that God is nothing but an idea in human minds and hence in human brains. Now, if you believe that, it's obvious that atheism is a tiny step further in belief. And most materialists are atheists. Some of them are militant atheists. Others are moderate agnostics. But nevertheless, this is the belief system which has come to dominate science since the 19th century. It's taught implicitly to scientists. Most of them are not actually taught this is the belief system, here are the basic points. It's an implicit system that seeps into people's consciousness as they become educated in science, or indeed educated at all. Because in England, for educated people, the default position of the average university graduate is materialism and atheism. If you don't believe it, it usually is taken to show that you're feeble-minded or superstitious or backward intellectually or something like that. So this is a very widespread worldview, which isn't just found among scientists, but among in our whole society. What I'm going to do this evening is summarize the basic dogmas of this worldview and show what happens when you turn them into questions. The basic materialist creed grew up in two stages. I'll have to do a few historical flashbacks so you can see it in context. The first stage was, as many of you know, the mechanistic revolution in the 17th century. Previously, people in Europe thought that nature was animate, the world was alive, that living organisms and all plants and animals had souls which organized the form of their body and underlay the instincts of the animals. The human soul was embedded in a vegetative and animal soul that linked us to plants and animals, largely unconscious, the vegetative and animal soul within human beings. And the entire cosmos was permeated by conscious beings, angels and spirits. So it was a living world. That was exactly what the mechanistic revolution was a revolution against. Instead, the world was now a machine from the 17th century onwards, made of inanimate matter. But the world of spirit still existed. For most scientists of that time, there was a dualistic world where there was the machinery of matter and a non-physical world of spirit, which included human minds, angels, and God. The rest of nature, including all animals, became machines, and therefore it was perfectly okay to vivisect them or to treat them as badly as you liked, because they were just machines. Human beings alone were unique. So this dualism that accompanied early science split the world into two parts, spirit and matter, and split the world we live in into two parts, human beings and all the rest. And it worked very well as an underlying philosophy for the mechanistic world. The materialist step went further, and this mainly happened in the 19th century. It involved denying the existence of spirit and matter altogether, so you were just left with matter, inanimate matter, mechanically functioning, and the human mind, like animal minds, became nothing but the activity of the brain. So materialism goes beyond mechanism, but is founded on it. The philosopher of science, Sir Karl Popper, pointed out that modern materialism is based on the principle of what he calls promissory materialism. Materialists haven't proved that the world really works like this. They assume it does. But what they say is that it will be found in the future that it really is like this. They will be able to prove it at some undated time in the future. And they do what Popper said, they issue undated promissory notes against future explanations. Well, the promissory notes have been falling due in the last decade or two, and the results have not been too good. There's now a major credibility crunch for materialism. The idea that all of life could be explained in terms of genes and molecules propelled the Human Genome Project, which was completed in 2001. There was a tremendous fanfare. People thought this would lead to a total transformation of our understanding of human beings. And we were told that the human genome was the key to the secrets of human life. We'd understand everything about humans. Well, it turned out to be a damp squib. there were only about a quarter the number of genes that people originally expected, and it turned out we share many of them with many other different organisms. Chimpanzees are about 99% the same as us. Fruit flies have 17,000 genes. We have 23,000. Rice plants have 38,000. We don't have that many more genes than in fact, we have less than many plants. So the attempt to explain life in terms of mechanisms and genes hasn't been going too well. The attempt to explain minds in terms of neurophysiology and brain functioning hasn't been going too well either. So then you may think, well, why don't we turn to physics? Surely they're delivering on these promises. Well, their things aren't looking too good either. There are big, big problems in the very core of physics. The main theoretical endeavor of the last 30 years has been string theory, or M theory, theories with 10 or 11 dimensions. The great majority of theoretical physicists work on these theories, and yet they haven't yet come up with a single testable prediction. Some physicists think that there's something seriously wrong in the heart of physics. One critique of string theory published a few years ago was called Not Even Wrong, because it's not testable. And in Lee Smolin's book, The Trouble with Physics, he shows how this particular approach has distorted theoretical physics and ended up with untestable theories, that there's no way of finding out if they're right or not. Is this science? Meanwhile, in cosmology, there's been a proliferation of mysterious entities like dark matter and dark energy, which now make up 96% of the universe, and we don't know what they are. So it's as if science has discovered the cosmic unconscious. And at the same time, there's been a proliferation of universes. In the multiverse theory, there are now billions, trillions of other universes parallel to our own, according to many modern cosmologists, for which there's not a single shred of evidence. So these are supposed to be the firm foundations on which reductionist science is built, and they're not very firm at all. What I'm going to do now is go through the 10 dogmas one by one and show what happens when you turn them into questions. I can't go into great detail on all of these because I'd only have about 4 minutes per dogma. So I'm going to say a little bit more about some and less about others. The first dogma, everything is essentially mechanical, tells us that the world is a machine, animals and plants are machines. And the key thing about machines as opposed to organisms is that organisms organize themselves. They have their organizing principles, their purposes, their goals within them. Machines are constructed and designed by external agencies, human beings. This extrapolates human machine-making activity onto the whole universe. And at first, mechanistic scientists welcomed it because they thought it provided a new argument for the existence of God, because if the world's a machine, there has to be a machine maker, God. And this mechanistic God was one of the reasons some of them thought that mechanistic science was a good thing. It provided a new argument for the existence of God. But the traditional God of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam is not a machine-making God who designs nature from outside. He was the God of a living universe. So this nature is essentially, everything's essentially mechanical, is the dogma. And if we ask, is nature mechanical, we find that in fact, in many ways, living organisms are not mechanical, they're living organisms. Within biology, there's been an opposing school to mechanism for centuries. So until the beginning of the 20th century, vitalists argued that living organisms were not just machines. And since the beginning of the 20th century, the organismic or holistic philosophy has made it clear that living organisms are actually organisms. And indeed, everything in nature is an organism. You can't prove that nature is just mechanical. You can't prove it. It's just a metaphor, and it's not a testable hypothesis at all. The standard view among materialists and atheists is that science is entirely based on evidence, and my main point at the moment is that this is not the case. The most fundamental beliefs are not evidence-based. Many lay atheists have a very romantic view of science. For example, Ricky Gervais, not a deep thinker, but a popular figure, and he had a column in last year's Wall Street Journal at Christmas to talk about his beliefs. He ridiculed religion and then contrasted it with science, and this is what he said of science. Science seeks the truth, and it does not discriminate. For better or worse, it finds things out. Science is humble. It knows what it knows, and it knows what it doesn't know. It bases its conclusions and beliefs on hard evidence, evidence that is constantly updated and upgraded. It doesn't get offended when new facts come along. It embraces the body of knowledge. It doesn't hold on to medieval practices because they are tradition. Well, you see, this idealized view of science is extremely different from science as actually practiced and as actually studied by sociologists, philosophers, and historians of science. It's a kind of idealization of an evidence-based view. I accept the idealization, actually. I rather believe in this idealized view of science. So what I'm trying to do is apply it to the dogmas of science. Well, I don't need to dwell on the mechanistic issue because you've all come across this many times before. But in my discussion of it in the Science Delusion, I come up with a number of, I think, new insights into this, particularly the hidden goddesses that lurk under the surface of mechanistic thought. All matter is unconscious. Matter was defined as unconscious in the 17th century, and consciousness was defined as separate from matter. This was a matter of definition. And when materialists got rid of the realm of spirit, then everything became unconscious. So the question is matter unconscious? And the first and most obvious exception to that is our own consciousness. If our brains, which are material systems, are in some way connected with our consciousness, and if the materialist theory says consciousness emerges from our brains, then the matter of our brains must in some way become conscious. Now, this has caused people in philosophy of mind and consciousness studies to tie themselves in knots trying to explain away human consciousness. Eliminative materialists say it doesn't really exist, it's an illusion. Others say it's an epiphenomenon that doesn't do anything. It's just a byproduct of brain activity. But some materialist philosophers have given up that pretense. And Galen Strawson, for example, wrote an interesting paper in the Journal of Consciousness Studies a few years ago called Does Materialism Imply Panpsychism? He came to the conclusion that if matter can be conscious in human brains, there must be a potential for consciousness in matter at every level, including electrons and atoms. This is one of the world's top materialist philosophers. And panpsychism is now on the agenda in the academic world. Now, of course, ever since the Descartes and the 17th century dualists tried to split matter and mind, there have been philosophers trying to put them together, including Spinoza and Leibniz in the 17th century, and Whitehead in the 20th century. And of these, Whitehead, I think, is much the most interesting, and probably the philosopher that points the way forward. Of all modern philosophers, the one who has most to teach us. One of Whitehead's insights about the relation of mind and matter in electrons and in humans is that they have different directions of causation, that the kind of causation associated with minds is a causation that works backwards from the present towards the past, whereas physical causation works forwards from the past towards the present and the future. And I think Whitehead's insight is a particularly key one, because people who try to explain the mind-matter problem in spatial terms don't get on too well. People often say the mind's the inside, the body's the outside. But Whitehead's key insight was they differ in their relation to time. Everything in nature is not an object, a thing, a material structure, it's a process. And processes tend towards ends or goals, and those ends or goals, as it were, work back from virtual futures to affect what happens in the present. Energetic causation working from the past flows in the other direction. So the two, as it were, meet in minds, and in the interaction of mind and body is like an interaction of two different causal or directional flows. This aspect of Whitehead's philosophy is rather obscure, and I recently had a chance to discuss it with some of the world's top Whitehead scholars at Claremont in California. And if you're interested, there was a 2-day seminar discussing Whitehead's work in relation to morphic resonance and inheritance and memory. And it's all online in streaming video. You can see it all from my website. Now, the total amount of matter and energy is always the same. The principle of conservation of matter and energy. This seems to be one of the firmest and most fundamental of all the scientific beliefs or principles or dogmas. And for me, this was the very last one I ever thought of challenging. I didn't even start challenging this until about a year or two ago. I've spent years challenging other ones, but this was the one doctrine that I thought was inviolate. The one thing that was so firmly established it was beyond question. And so it took me a long time, as I say, before I began to question it. But when I did begin to question it, I found it was probably the shakiest of them all. It's a house of cards. First of all, if you look at it historically, the reasons for believing this are not to do with measurements to 10 decimal points, precise laboratory measurements. It's philosophical. For the ancient Greek atomists, the precursors of modern materialism, the total amount of matter was always the same because it was made up of eternal atoms, which were defined as eternal objects which couldn't split up or couldn't change. Therefore, there always had to be the same number of them. Therefore, the total amount of matter was always the same. It was a brilliant intellectual insight, but it wasn't based on detailed laboratory observations at all. It was a philosophical idea, turning eternity into matter. The Greek philosophers were trying to find different theories of eternity. Plato chose eternal forms, Pythagoras chose eternal mathematics, the materialists chose eternal matter, the same in quantity forever. And in the 17th century, at the beginning of the mechanistic revolution, it was universally assumed that when God made the machine universe, he imparted into the universe a certain amount of motion, and that this continued indefinitely, being God-given. So the total amount of energy, movement, or change was the same. That's the root of this doctrine, nothing to do with empirical investigations. And if you say, well, how are we getting on in terms of proving it empirically? The answer is not very well. 20 or 30 years ago, astronomers hypothesized dark matter to account for anomalies in the way that galaxies hold together and interact with each other. They were holding together more than they should and interacting more than they should. So how they dealt with this is to say, well, they must all be surrounded by extra matter that we can't see, dark matter. And you put in just the right amount to make the equations balance and the whole thing work. But then if you say, well, what is it? The fact is, nobody knows. It's utterly mysterious. It's literally obscure. And more recently, astronomers and cosmologists have introduced dark energy, which is pushing the universe apart. And it's accelerating, it's expanding faster than it did before. They used to think it did. So they've got this expansive force. Now, dark matter and dark energy make up 96% of the known universe. We don't know anything about them, really. There's rival theories of dark matter and dark energy. So can we say for sure that the total amount of matter and energy is always the same? If we ask the question, is the total amount always the same? Is the total amount of dark matter and dark energy and ordinary matter and ordinary energy always the same? Well, not really. I mean, dark matter and dark energy were unknown until a few decades ago, and suddenly physicists have hypothesized or invented more than 20 times as much as we already knew about. So, and what if they can be converted to regular forms of matter and energy? That would lead to huge changes or fluctuations, or could do. We simply don't know. And when you come to energy in living organisms, the evidence becomes even more shaky for the constancy of matter and energy. Again, this is something I never thought fit to challenge. I mean, never thought it could be challenged. And when I looked at the history, just in the last couple of years, I discovered that this was actually really, really questionable. In the early 19th century, vitalists were quite influential in biology and medicine, and they claimed that living organisms had a special kind of energy, different from ordinary energy found in machines and material systems. And this vital energy was energy. It caused activities and changes, but it wasn't the same as the standard energy in physics or chemistry. It was another kind. Now, this was opposed by the mechanistic school in biology, the prominent member of whom in the 1840s and 50s was Hermann von Helmholtz, best known as a physicist today. But he started as a medical student and a doctor in the Prussian army. And he made it his life's work to rid science of vitalism. He had tackled the question of energy. He started trying to prove that living organisms only have the same kind of energy as non-living things by measuring the heat given off when he caused frogs' legs to contract by stimulating them electrically. But it was very hard to get accurate measurements, so he gave up trying to prove it experimentally and adopted a theoretical approach. He argued that since living organisms are machines, the issue at stake, then they must follow the same laws as ordinary machines and obey the law of conservation of energy and so forth. And therefore, living organisms were nothing but machines. He assumed what he set out to prove and then proved it with the assumption that they're machines in the first place. This then became built into the foundations of biology as an unquestionable truth. Anyone who said there are other forms of energy, chi, prana, vital energies, and so forth, they were dismissed as pseudo-scientists because science knew that there was only the regular kinds in living organisms. This was known by scientists with total certainty from the 1850s onwards. It wasn't until the 1890s that someone actually tried to prove it. A German called Max Rubner put an unfortunate dog inside a metal box for 5 weeks, measuring the oxygen in, carbon dioxide out, heat, exercise, energy, feces, urine, measured everything, and came out with roughly the right answer. It wasn't until 1899 that these principles were applied to humans in the classic studies of two Americans called Atwater and Benedict. They laid the foundations for the textbook science of nutrition and the understanding of energy balances in humans. They started with the assumption that humans obey exactly the same laws as animals and the whole of the rest of nature. They were mechanists, in fact, very committed ones. And in their paper, they say that it's never been measured in humans before. It's indubitably true, but we thought it would help the cause of science to demonstrate it. They don't say we're looking into it, they're demonstrating it. And so they did some observations with people in calorimeters. They measured the heat produced, the urine, the feces, the energy in, the weight gain or loss, the oxygen, the carbon dioxide, and so on. They have this elaborate piece of apparatus in a laboratory in America. And it came out with the wrong answer. So they said, well, that means we've got the wrong conversion factors for the calorific value of the food. So they changed the conversion factors to get the correct answer. And they then went on doing it and found astonishing discrepancies. When people were doing no exercise, they seemed to be using too much energy. when they were doing a lot of exercise and not eating much, they seemed to have more energy than they ought to have had from the food they took in. However, they managed to deal with these discrepancies by doing just the right number of studies of people above and below the correct value. And so when they averaged them out, they came out to the right answer within 99.9% of the expected answer. This was then hailed as a triumph, the death knell of vitalism, the final nail in the coffin of vitalism and mysticism and so forth. The experiments were repeated in the 1920s, but they often gave the wrong results. And so at a congress of the American Nutritional Society, there was a big issue rose out of these discrepancies that people were getting, and they were explained away as being due to inexperienced operators using this apparatus. And the whole issue then went dormant until the 1970s, when a brave maverick American scientist called Paul Webb started redoing these experiments. And he found that there were major discrepancies. 25% in many of his experiments of the energy was not accounted for. He called it X, an unknown form of energy that seemed to be coming from a source that he couldn't explain. But nobody was very interested in Webb's results because they already knew the answer. It's where everything obeys the laws of energy. And meanwhile, the whole science of nutrition is littered with anomalies, people who seem to live on too little food. The extreme cases people who live on no food at all. It's called inedia in the scientific literature, which means fasting. There are many cases in India of people who are said to live for years without eating. When I was traveling with my wife Jill in Rajasthan about 25 years ago, we came across a case like this. We went to see this woman called Satima, and of course I assumed, since I hadn't challenged these dogmas till a couple of years ago, I just assumed she must be a fraud, and that she was obviously eating secretly, her devotees were willfully blinded to the obvious facts, and so forth. But there were many other cases, and some have been investigated scientifically. Last year, a big important case in India with quite credible scientists studying this person over weeks and found no evidence of fraud, no evidence of cheating, and yet peculiar ability to live without food. There have been many Christian saints who've done this over the ages. It's happened in China and elsewhere, and also not only among saints, but also among people with various kinds of sickness. In the 19th century, there was an outbreak of a fasting girl syndrome, a kind of early form of anorexia. And some of these girls seem to live without food for extraordinary lengths of time. So there are huge anomalies in the nutritional literature. And this isn't one of the branches of science that one can claim is the most successful and triumphant. We have more than a billion people in the world obese or overweight. And nutritional science hasn't come up with surefire dieting methods or solutions to these very obvious problems. But nevertheless, the whole thing carries on along established lines because this question cannot be asked, because the dogma says it's always the same. I think this is one of the areas where asking these questions and approaching the research in a fresh way could yield to quite surprising, exciting, and probably important results. I mean, after all, in an era of world hunger, one way of dealing with it is increasing the supply. That's the way the entire system works at the moment. Another way would be reducing the demand. And if it turns out that actually there are ways of living with much less food than we usually assume is necessary, and of course people would differ, this might be something rather important to know. The next dogma is that the laws of nature are fixed. They were all fixed at the moment of the Big Bang, when all the matter and energy in the universe is supposed to have appeared from nowhere. The one officially recognized violation of the principle of conservation of matter and energy. All the laws of nature are supposed to appear at the same time from nowhere. And the constants of nature are also supposed to have been fixed. So we can ask the question, are the laws and constants of nature fixed? Well, there's very little evidence that they are. This is just an assumption, an a priori assumption, and scientists take it for granted not because they've thought about it, but because they haven't. This is something I've spent years challenging because morphic resonance, which is my main theoretical work, suggests that the laws of nature are more like habits. I'm not the first person to suggest that in an evolutionary universe, the universe may have habits as opposed to fixed laws. But I think the evidence supports the habit idea much better than it supports the fixed law idea. So we can ask this question, are the laws and constants fixed? I'm not going to talk about the laws, because many of you have heard me talk about morphic resonance before, but I'm just going to focus on the constants. You can ask the question, are the constants constant? If you look up the values of constants in physics textbooks, there are handbooks of physical constants that keep coming out in new editions. They give you a value of all the constants like the speed of light, the universal gravitational constant, the charge on the electron, the fine structure constant. There are a number of so-called fundamental physical constants. And you can look them up in libraries or online, and there you get a value. And they're often defined with very impressive precision, many places of decimals, plus or minus 0.0000002, that kind of thing. So they look as if they're extremely well defined. But if you look at the history of the constants, it turns out they vary. And they vary quite a lot. And when they vary, it's simply assumed that the latest value must be the best and all the previous variations were errors. For example, the speed of light dropped by about 20 kilometers per second all around the world between 1928 and 1945. This was found in labs all over the world. They showed precise values with very small error bars. And then in 1945, it went up again by about 20 kilometers per second. And at first, there was a wide spread of values, but then it converged on a value, again, with very small error bars. And so what was going on here? Did the speed of light really drop between 1928 and 1945, as the data show? If we follow Mr. Gervais, we'd say, well, yes, we go where the data lead us. But not so. No, it was assumed at the time that that was the true value of the speed of light. But when it went up again, it was assumed that the new value was the true value, and it couldn't really have changed. One or two people said maybe it varies cyclically, and then people said, oh no, you can't have that. It's a constant. It's a fundamental constant central to Einstein's theory. In 1972, this problem was solved by defining the speed of light. So it's fixed by definition now, and the meter was then defined in terms of the speed of light. So if the speed of light changed, the meter would change in length so that the speed would remain constant. So the speed of light is now fixed. It can't vary. So how did it vary? I went to see the head of metrology in the National Physical Laboratory in Teddington when I discovered by doing research on the history of the fundamental constants that there were a lot of big changes, including this change in the speed of light. And the head of metrology was a very nice man called Brian Petley. And he said to me, I said to him, I've been looking at these data and there seems to have been this massive drop and then it went up again. How do you explain it? I said, could the speed of light have really changed? So he said, no, of course not. It's a constant. So I said, well, then how do you explain this drop all over the world in all these laboratories? I said, were people simply fudging the results to get what was the fashionable value at the time? He said, oh, we don't like to use words like that, he said. I said, well, what words do you use? He said, we prefer to call it intellectual phase locking. So he said people would correct the values till they got the right one and more or less what's expected. And then the fashion changed. So how can you be sure? What do the data tell us? When you come to the gravitational constant, that's a very interesting one because it still varies enormously. I should say, when I left Petley, I thanked him for talking to me about this. And as I was leaving, he reached down behind his desk. There was a cardboard box on the floor. And he said, "Oh, you might want one of these. They've just arrived from the printers. The latest values of the physical constants." So the gravitational constant fluctuates rather wildly. And here are some of the values varying over more than 1% in recent years. These are all from reputable, serious, proper laboratories, measuring gravitation in very careful ways. And this huge fluctuation in the gravitational constant is a cause of a lot of concern for scientists. It's the oldest of the physical constants. It's Newton's constant. And yet it seems to fluctuate rather wildly. Now, some people actually predicted it would change when you measured it at different times. Alfred North Whitehead had a theory of gravitation different from Einstein's. His theory predicted that G would change as measured on Earth. But what if it really changes? Would we ever find out? Well, we wouldn't if people do what they do now. They take the observations from different days in the same lab where they fluctuate, then they average them to get the average value, discarding what they call outliers, ones that are too far from what they think the true value would be. Then central committees get together and take the values from different labs around the world, and they average those. But if some labs have values that seem very different from everyone else, they discard those because those are outliers. And they weight the data in favor of highly prestigious labs like the National Physical Laboratory or the National Bureau of Standards in America. They disregard data that come from labs they think are more flaky. And then they arrive at this weighted average value, and that is the latest value of the gravitational constant. Now, what if the gravitational constant really did vary as measured on Earth? This isn't a very radical proposal. This isn't to do with the fundamentals of science exactly, but, for example, if there's variable amounts of dark matter, and as the Earth rotates in our galaxy day and night, it might be pointing to there might be differential influences of gradients of dark matter. Measurements at MIT recently showed a daily fluctuation in the gravitational constant, depending on the way the Earth's pointing in relation to the stars. Maybe there's a daily fluctuation. Maybe it has explanations within existing physics. But we'll never find out if we don't look at the data. In 1994, in my book, 7 Experiments That Could Change the World, I proposed that scientists in labs around the world could pool their data of the gravitational constant and analyze them together to find if they were all down on one day and up on another day. If they were correlated around the world, it might show that there were actual fluctuations in gravitational constant as measured on Earth. I haven't persuaded anybody to do this, and the reason they won't do it is because it's constant. So you don't ask the question, could it vary? And this is one of the simplest and most elementary and easily soluble issues in science, because the data are already there. It's just a matter of statistical analysis, if one could persuade the labs to share their data. So the idea that all the laws are fixed is very, very questionable. I think they evolve in an evolving universe. The idea the constants are fixed maybe is questionable too. They may even vary or fluctuate randomly or within certain limits. And I think the day may come when if one opens Nature, a weekly journal of science, one may see a report saying this week's value of the constants. You know, G is up this week. The charge on the electrons held steady. E, the fine structure constant has fluctuated but recovered ground towards the end of the week. You know, like financial reports and the Dow Jones Index and trading in gold and so forth. It could be that it's like that, but we'll never know if we approach the whole of nature with this blinkered, dogmatic mindset. This is one of the easiest things to remedy, as I say. Nature is purposeless. There are no purposes in nature because machines have no purposes inside themselves. The purposes are outside them. Your car has no purpose in the sense of wanting to go to one place rather than another. If you had a horse, it might have its own purpose because it's an organism, but a machine doesn't. It'll go wherever you point it. Even guided missiles, which show goal-directed behavior, have to be programmed to go to particular goals. So machines have goals put and purposes put into them, but don't have their own. Organisms have their own, and that's what makes machines and organisms different. In the machine theory of nature, nature is purposeless. Organisms have no purposes. But of course they do. We have purposes, so where do they come from? Dogs have purposes. They have purposes that are very clear and actually exert measurable physical forces. If you have a spring balance in the lead of a dog and you take it near a bitch on heat, you'll have a measurable force exerted as it strains at the leash to get towards the bitch on heat. And there is a directed purposive force. It's not just a mechanical force, it's to do with a purpose that's inherent to the dog. So, in animal behavior, we see plenty of purposes, and so we do in developmental biology. Organisms develop towards goals. If you disrupt their development, they get to the same goal anyway. This is goal-directed behavior. There are various examples from embryology which show this very clearly. This, some of you are familiar with, is a dragonfly embryo inside a dragonfly egg. And here we have the normal embryo inside the normal egg case. In this case, the egg was tied in the middle. This part was killed. And this part of the embryo, which would normally just be the back part of it, develops into a small but complete embryo. The only way you can understand this kind of behavior is in terms of attractors, that the end or the goal somehow attracts the developmental process towards it. This shows even more strikingly in this giant single-celled alga, Acetabularia. This alga has a rhizoid, it has a nucleus, one nucleus in the root, has a long thin stalk and a cap, which is photosynthetic. The whole thing's about 2 inches tall, and it's all one single cell. Now, if you cut the organism off and just leave the root bit with the nucleus, it regenerates a whole new stalk and cap. It's somehow drawn back to the final form of the normal form of the organism. Even more remarkable, if you cut a bit out of the stalk here, this can regenerate a whole new cap and grow a bit more stalk as well. It doesn't regenerate a rhizoid. But all of this is regenerated in the absence of a nucleus. For those who believe that genes control everything, this is a devastating observation because there isn't even a nucleus there. It doesn't need a nucleus. The nucleus isn't like the brain of the cell. The whole cell is organized by a principle, a morphogenetic field is the term that's usually used in biology for this, not just in my own work, but in mainstream biology, which is goal-directed and leads the organism towards an end or a goal. Of course, materialists have to admit the purposefulness of living organisms, and they do so by concepts like the selfish gene. The genes are competing with each other to gain advantage. Richard Dawkins famously compared them to ruthless Chicago gangsters, competing so they can gain advantage over the others, molding matter, shaping form, indulging in evolutionary arms races. All very cartoon-like personified imagery of genes. Genes are just molecules. They couldn't possibly be purposive like successful Chicago gangsters. This is projecting purposiveness onto living things. The other metaphor, very common in biology, is the computer program, that living organisms are genetically programmed. Programs are designed by intelligent designers, humans, to achieve goals or objects. They're purposive, directive principles, exactly what mechanistic biology is supposed to deny, but which has been smuggled back in. My main criticism of modern mechanistic biology is not that it's mechanistic, but that it's crypto-vitalist. It's riddled with vitalistic metaphors. Dawkins is a vitalist, essentially, who portrays living organisms in completely vitalistic language, rather unpleasant vitalistic language, and then in the small print says, of course, it's only a metaphor. But the entire persuasive power of his rhetoric comes from attributing things to living organisms that the mechanistic theory says they can't possibly have. And the whole of physics is now, or at least dynamics, the mathematics of change, has now introduced ends or goals. The word for them is attractor. And a lot of modern mathematical dynamics is based on the idea of attractors, which draw things towards ends or goals. So effectively, scientists have reintroduced purposes and goals while officially denying them, because they're undeniable, they're part of nature. That's to do with the purposive behavior of plants and animals and people pursuing their normal goals. But there's also the bigger question of what is the purpose of the entire evolutionary process. Now, immediately, mechanistic biologists will say, and materialists will say, well, there is no purpose. There are no purposes in nature. The whole of evolution is totally purposeless. But how can they prove that? How do they know that? The answer is, it's just an assumption. They have no evidence for it at all. It's simply an assumption that's built into this particular philosophy. And if you look at evolution, different philosophers see it in different ways. Some biologists say, yes, it's totally purposeless. It just happens to have produced a wide variety of complex organisms like us. Other people say, well, there's a process of complexification in evolution, a process that leads towards the development of more consciousness and so forth, and that the whole process has a purpose. I'm not going to go into that now, but I'm just saying this is an open question. And the idea that it can be closed by simply assuming that nature's purposeless, it is simply unscientific. Scientists have had to reintroduce purpose into nature in disguised forms. All biological inheritance is material. All forms of inheritance are coded in genes, and more recently, with material epigenetic modifications of genes like methylation of DNA. I'm not going to go into all the details of epigenetics this evening, but I've thought for a long time that genes are grossly overrated. Here's the question: is all biological inheritance material? Well, the common assumption is that it is, and that was what gave the energy, the investment, and the enthusiasm to the Genome Project. People thought this was the key to life. Biotechnology companies thought that by patenting genes and by understanding the molecules of inheritance, they'd have power to control life. And that was the thing that excited them and appalled opponents of genetic modification. But I've never been as appalled or as excited as many people, because I've always thought they grossly overestimated the role of the genes. And it turns out that that's what had happened. Many of you may not have heard yet of the missing heritability problem, but this is one of the big crises in the heart of biology at present. Before the Genome Project, it was assumed that everything could be explained in terms of genes. Many biologists still believe that. And 2 years ago, I had a wager with Professor Lewis Wolpert, one of Britain's leading biologists, formerly chairman of the Committee on the Public Understanding of Science, a noted materialist and a militant atheist. He and I were having a debate at Cambridge in the Science Festival on the nature of life. And he said, in the course of this debate, that it wouldn't be long before, given the genome of the fertilized egg of a human being, we'd be able to predict every detail of the ensuing organism just on the basis of the genes. I took him up on this, and I said, well, I bet you that that's not going to happen. I said, I bet you a bottle of champagne it doesn't happen in 20 years. And faced with the prospect of losing a bottle of champagne, his opinion shifted fast. He said, well, maybe not 20 years. I said, well, how long, 50? He said, oh, no, maybe 100. So I said, but Lewis, you and I and our grandchildren will be dead by then. It's not really a testable prediction. I mean, this is the ultimate promissory materialism. The undated promissory note. I said, I want a dated bet. And we followed it up afterwards. We agreed it had to be within 20 years to be realistic. We asked the advice of David Lorimer, who many of you know, of the Scientific and Medical Network, as to what would gain in value over 20 years as opposed to losing in value. Obviously, money would lose in value. We wanted something that would gain. David's suggestion was fine port. So Lewis Walpert and I bought a case of Quinta de Vesuvio 2005, which the experts say will be drinking perfectly by 2029, when our bet terminates. And the bet was published in New Scientist. He bet that, when at first I said, well, okay, it won't be a human. He said, okay, a mouse. So I said, all right, then the bet would be within 20 years, given the genome, the genome of the fertilized egg of a mouse, every detail of the ensuing organism could be predicted. He said, okay, agreed. A week later, he emailed back to say, well, I think a mouse is going to be too difficult. It'd have to be a chick. So I said, all right, let's say a mouse or a chick. A week later, well, even a chick's a bit, it'd have to be a frog. I said, all right, a mouse, a chick, or a frog. And I thought we'd got the final wording. And he emailed me again. He said, I gather there's a bit of a problem with some of these things. And he said, it's going to have to be a nematode worm. And there's this nematode worm 1 millimeter long called Caenorhabditis elegans, whose genome has been sequenced. It's much studied by biologists. And even that, I said, well, in that case, you need to predict how all the proteins would fold. Not just the genome. You've got to get from the genes to the proteins. That's the first step. He said, oh, yes, all right. Then he rang me back and said, well, there's a problem with this. I understand there's a bit of a problem understanding protein folding. Why don't we leave that out? And I said, we can't leave that as part of the bet, So anyway, we finally ended up with a form of the bet by May the 1st, 2029, given the genome of the fertilized egg of an organism, animal or plant, it will be possible to predict all the details of the ensuing organism. He bets that will happen. I bet it won't. And the great majority of biologists think I'm going to win. So even Walpert, last time I saw him, said, Rupert, I think you're going to win our bet. The fact is, it's not happening the way people thought it would. Until very recently, he was very confident that genes would explain everything. On the basis of the genome project, people have now sequenced more than 30,000 genomes of people, and they've started looking to see how much the genes explain. They started with height. I mean, height's easily observable. You can measure people's height with a tape measure. It's non-controversial. And it's been known for many years that if you measure people's height and you measure the height of their fully grown children, you can predict the height of the children on the basis of the parents' height with an accuracy of 80 or 90%. In technical language, that is, height is 80 or 90% heritable. And it's just been assumed that that happens on the basis of the genes, the DNA. Now, on the basis of 30,000 different people's genomes, knowing the height of these people, they worked out which genes were involved in height. There were about 50 genes played a role in height. They made a mathematical model to combine the influence of these genes, and then tested the model by taking the genome of somebody whose height they didn't know, but whose height was known, they just weren't shown it, and predict that person's height on the basis of the genome. It turned out they could do so with an accuracy of 5%. Now, you could do it with an accuracy of 80 to 90% just using a tape measure, without spending tens of billions of pounds on the genome project. And this has caused a grave crisis in the heart of biology. It's called the missing heritability problem. Some people like Steve Jones of University College London, the geneticist, say that this shows the whole project's a failure, and to go on spending billions more in this kind of research is throwing good money after bad. But the defenders of it say, well, this just shows there must be yet more subtle genes and genetic modifiers we haven't yet identified. Give us another few £1 billion and we'll soon fix this problem in a few more years. Well, that's the state of play, and the promises of genetic medicine, and that we were all told would result from this vast investment of hundreds of millions of dollars, probably billions of dollars, many billions of dollars, have been extraordinarily unsuccessful. A Harvard Business School report 3 years ago said that this was the biggest money-losing enterprise ever devised by man, and that the return on investment was pitifully small. In fact, it was negative. The Wall Street Journal called it a black hole into which investment fell. And yet this was going to be the white heat of the transformation of humanity. The 21st century was the century of biotechnology and so forth. It just hasn't worked out. It's been a really bad investment. And so we're talking here not just ideas, false ideas, and illusions produced by rhetoric like selfish genes and genetic programming, but something which has led to the vast wastage of public money that could have been more fruitfully spent on more interesting and useful research. It's skewed the whole priorities of biology and science. So it may be that some biological inheritance isn't material. I think a lot of it depends on morphic resonance, that most of it is a collective memory rather than coded in the genes. Now here's the next dogma, dogma 7. Memories are stored as material traces in the brain. It's been assumed for a long time that memories are stored in brains as material traces. Many attempts have been made to find these traces. They've failed over and over and over again. Billions and billions of dollars, huge research efforts. Why have they failed? My theory is that it's because they aren't there in the first place. If we ask the question, are memories stored as material traces, then we get to a very different approach from just starting from the assumption they are. And there have been a variety of people, not just me, who've suggested that memories depend on a direct connection across time, a kind of resonance across time. I think that we tune into ourselves in the past. Our brains are more like TV tuners than they are like video recorders, that the memories are not stored in the brain. Now, we know that when memories are laid down, there's a lot of activity in regions of the brain like the hippocampus. We know when they're retrieved, there's lots of activity in the brain. I think that's the pattern of activity which resonates when they're laid down and when they're retrieved. Between those two periods, I don't think they're stored as memory traces in the brain. I think we're seeing a resonant connection across time, not a physical storage in modified nerve endings or phosphorylated proteins or whatever. And Eric Kandel, who got the Nobel Prize for his work on memory, himself very reductionistic, admitted this in his Nobel acceptance speech. He said, "How do different regions of the hippocampus and the median temporal lobe interact in the storage of explicit memory? We do not, for example, understand why the initial storage of memory requires the hippocampus, whereas the hippocampus is not required once a memory has been stored for weeks or months. What critical information does the hippocampus convey to the neocortex? ? The assumption here is that the memories are shifted into some other part of the brain where they've remained forever elusive and then retrieved when needed, but no one's ever found them. The holographic theory tries to explain this by saying they're spread over large regions of the brain holographically, but it's simpler to assume that they're not there at all. And if this is true, then if people learn something in one place, others should be able to learn it more quickly somewhere else because of resonance rather than because of traces in the brain. There's a lot of evidence that actually happens. I won't go into it now because time's running out and I've only got a few minutes for the remaining dogmas. Minds are inside heads. This, of course, turns into the question, are minds confined to heads? Well, I don't think they are. And in present-day consciousness studies, it's generally admitted there's no evidence that our mental experience is confined to our head. When you see me standing here now, for example, your image of me appears to be located outside your head, where I'm standing. Now, the conventional view is that your image of me and of everybody else and of this room is all inside your head. When you look at the sky you're seeing is inside your head. And there's a big debate in philosophy of mind and in consciousness studies at the moment, triggered by a key paper a few years ago called "Is Your Skull Beyond the Sky?" And the proponent, the materialist, said, yes, it is. The skull, your skull is beyond the sky. The stars, the sky you see, is all inside your head. That means your skull must be outside it all. Everything we're experiencing is inside our skulls. The skull you think you've got is just a virtual skull that's part of a virtual reality display inside your head. And everything you're experiencing is inside your head. This room's inside your head. I'm inside your head. There's a little Rupert somewhere inside your head. But it's not out here. I'm suggesting that the images are just where they seem to be. They're outside the head, that vision involves a two-way process, the inward movement of light and the outward projection of images, that our minds are extended into the environment in every act of perception, that our minds are stretched out according to our intention and attention. They're not all inside the head. And there's no evidence, after all, they're all inside the head. No one's seen images inside the brain. No one's seen thoughts inside the brain. They've seen changes in the brain, but that doesn't mean that all the images are there. So this is actually subject to a great deal of debate at the moment within consciousness studies. One school of thought called radical externalism says more or less what I'm saying, that these experiences are actually outside the head. Our consciousness isn't confined to the inside of our head. I think of it as like fields underlying consciousness that are inside the brain and beyond it, just as the fields of your mobile telephone are inside the phone and stretch out beyond it. And so I think the fields of the mind are much more extensive than the brain. Dogma 8 leads to dogma 9. Psychic phenomena are illusory. And of course the question is, are psychic phenomena illusory? If thoughts and intentions and attention are all inside the head, then they can't have effects at a distance. So for committed materialists, they know that all the evidence for psychic phenomena must be illusory. They just know that it's false. They don't need to study it. They just know it because their belief system tells them that. And one of the problems of doing research in this field is the persistence of an extremely dogmatic form of skepticism. I won't go into that. I'll just briefly say that there's now a lot of evidence that telepathy and other psychic phenomena occur in animals like dogs and cats, dogs knowing when their owners are coming home, for example, and in people in relation to telephone calls, telephone telepathy, on which I've done extensive studies. I'm going to zoom through these slides showing them. However, I'll just say that one of them you can do yourself. I now have an automated test on mobile phones that you can do. You can go to my website, to the online experiments portal, and try it yourself. This research is giving consistent, positive, significant results. People, the phenomenon is, you think of someone, then they call, and then you say, it's funny, I was just thinking about you. I think it happens because the person's intention reaches out ahead of the call and affects you. And you may start thinking about them, then they call. People can tell who's calling way above chance. It's not just coincidence. So psychic phenomena, the evidence shows they're not illusory. Most people believe they've had them. They're extremely common. The evidence supports them. And yet dogmatic materialists feel absolutely confident that they don't exist. It's a sure, complete triumph of dogma and faith over evidence and reason. I summarize in my book debates I've had with Professor Lewis Wolpert. Some of you were there. I had a debate at the Royal Society of Arts and on telepathy. It turned out he'd read none of the evidence, knew nothing whatever about it, and wasn't even interested. I had an encounter with Richard Dawkins I've described also. On my website, there's the full account, Richard Dawkins Comes to Call. And it turned out he too was utterly uninterested in the evidence. He knew that it didn't exist. All the evidence must be flawed or fraudulent. And I took part in a debate at the European Skeptics Congress in Brussels with a leading skeptic. And it turned out he too had not looked at any of the evidence. He tried to prove on theoretical grounds it was impossible. And when I said, well, can you show me what's wrong with the actual evidence? He said, oh, I haven't looked at it. I don't know what it is, because I know it must be wrong. It was completely frank, upfront, honest in that way. So we're dealing here with a belief system, nothing to do with, however much evidence you pile up, it doesn't matter for people who are convinced this is true. This is not science, it's dogma. And so my argument here, it's the most obvious case of dogmatism. Everybody in this room will have encountered dogmatic skeptics. It's less obvious when you're dealing with the conservation of matter and energy, the nature of inheritance or memory. But here's where we all know that there's a great deal of dogmatism. And finally, the last dogma, mechanistic medicine is the only kind that really works, is the dogma on which our National Health Service is to a large part based, the Medical Research Council's funding decisions, the official policies are all based on this official policy. Of course, there are alternative and complementary forms of medicine, but those are marginalized and are not a subject of research, at least in Britain, or very little research. But if we ask, is mechanistic medicine the only kind that really works? The answer is obviously no. Lots of kinds of medicine work. Then conventional defenders of materialism say, well, yes, they do work, but that's just the placebo effect. It's all in the mind. But since they believe the mind shouldn't affect the body and doesn't do anything, they're immediately in a frightfully difficult position, and they try and change the subject fast. It's also obvious from the hypnotic induction of blisters, which can be done. You can touch people with a pencil and say, this is a lighted cigarette end, and they'll develop a blister if they're hypnotized when that happens. The charming of warts, the fact that warts caused by viruses can be removed by all sorts of magical means, show that mental effects have huge effects on health, way beyond what our official physiology would admit. And so this question, is mechanistic medicine the only kind that really works? We can already see that it's not the only kind that really works, which then raises the question, how can we have a more effective medical system that makes use of the different systems, each with their strengths and weaknesses? And again, this is a subject I discuss in some detail in my book. So I should end really by saying that the overall picture is one of a scientific worldview propagated as truth all around the world, which, when you look at the detailed parts of the creed, every one of them turns out to be questionable, if not actually wrong. I think they're actually all wrong, but they're at least questionable, to put it in the most mild form. And this is the foundation not just of our society, the foundation of the worldview of educated people in our society. It's now being exported to the whole of the rest of the world. Last year, India graduated 2.5 million young people in science and engineering. China, 1.5 million. America, 500,000, but a third of the Americans were Chinese and Indian. So the majority of young scientists today are not Western, they're Asian. And they've all been filled up with this way of thinking. This is what we've taught them, it's what they've learned. There's a big campaign in China at the moment to close down alternative and Chinese medicine because it's unscientific. It's being resisted. But these are huge issues, and what I hope this book can show, and I hope I've given you a taste of it, is that the science delusion, this belief system which is running our world, is something we really need to move beyond, if only for the sake of science. Science will be more interesting, more fun, and I think more useful when we let go of this delusion and move on in a scientific way. Thank you.
Rupert, thank you very much indeed. A most wonderful exposition of a really creative mind, looking at the everyday problems in science and being honest in what he sees, not tying themselves into knots as we so often do. For example, in my own field of consciousness, listening to the amazing ways that people try to explain how it's all created by the brain when it clearly isn't, is totally ridiculous. And so I'm very, very pleased that Rupert has the first of all, the integrity, and now the authority to say, listen, guys, look at your assumptions. They could be wrong. So we have time for a few questions. And what I would like you to do is, if you want to hold a question, to ask a question, hold your hands up and attract the eye of the two people that have the microphones. There's one on either side. So who's going to ask the first question?
First, thank you very much, Rupert, for your talk. It was really, really great. But I would like to complain a little bit. Can you give me your thoughts and the comments about I think most important dogma, that matter producing consciousness?
That matter?
That matter producing consciousness. What's your comments about this one?
Well, I already mentioned the dogma that matter is unconscious. And my own thinking about it is that consciousness is the realm of possibility. What consciousness is a field in which, in my view, in which different possibilities can coexist. And they coexist in conscious form, in other words, with qualities and feelings. And that somehow this coexistence of possibility, which are possible futures, is what consciousness is mainly about. And in quantum theory, we have this a system of possible futures. The wave equations for an electron, as an electron starts off a journey from a particular point, the wave equations describe all the possible things it could do. And when it interacts with something like a measuring apparatus, all those possibilities collapse into one actual granular fact. That's sometimes called the collapse of the wave function. And I think our own consciousness is somewhat like that. We have realms of possibilities. As soon as we decide to do something, then it becomes an observable fact. You know, if you decide to come here this evening, for example, everyone made a decision to come here, then there's an observable fact. You can be filmed here, it's a measurable fact. But of all the possible alternative actions, those exist in consciousness. So I think that Whitehead's insight that there's a flow from the realm of possibility and future possibilities and virtual futures into the past, towards the past, is a key insight into understanding how consciousness interacts with matter, how minds interact with brains, and even how some kind of mental activity, even in electrons and atoms, may work. And he said that the main way in which it's expressed is through feelings. And feelings, we experience them as emotions. But think about it, I mean, even electrons have feelings. If they're getting near to something that's positively charged, there's a sort of urge to get there quicker. If they're near another electron that's negatively charged, there's a kind of repulsive thing. I don't like it here, I'll need to get away. I mean, we can project our own anthropomorphic language onto them. I don't suppose they certainly don't think in English or in human terms. But the idea that they have feelings, certainly attractions and repulsions, is just in accordance with the facts. We normally prefer to think of it as just in science, as a purely mathematical equation describing attraction or repulsion, or a field of attraction and repulsion, a vector field. But if you look at it from a subjective point of view of the electron, these might be feelings.
I don't know if this is on. Hello, hello. Oh, yes.
Yes.
Thank you for your wonderful talk. I wonder if I might ask a question about the decline effect, because it seems to me that one of the cornerstones of science is replicability of data, and there seems to be this problem that dogs, a lot of research into, say, telepathy or retrocausation, such as the research by Daryl Bem, and when they try to replicate, they get a slowly declining effect size. Whereas your idea of morphic resonance would suggest there's the principle of reinforcement of effects with time, and things would get stronger with time, whereas the decline effect seems to be in opposition to that. Things get weaker with time. I'm wondering what your views on that are. Thank you.
Well, probably you're referring to the fascinating article in the New Yorker on the decline effect last year, which was a really stunning piece of journalism, showing that in many branches of science, effects decline. The article was entitled "The Truth Wears Off." And it wasn't just in parapsychology, it was in regular psychology, even in biology. So I think it's true that in certain branches of science, effects decline. They don't all decline. Some people assume all parapsychological effects decline. That's not true. Some do, some don't. In my own experiments, I've found some that have declined and others that haven't. And in regular science, they don't all decline, otherwise you wouldn't be able to run undergraduate practical classes with standard lab experiments, which give more or less predictable results year after year. And machines wouldn't work. They'd all stop working. So I don't think it's a universal principle. But I do feel that in certain areas of research, anyone who takes part in any kind of scientific research, not just in controversial areas like parapsychology, but in regular mainstream science, like biochemistry or something, anyone who comes up with a new result is immediately attacked by peer reviewers and by the colleagues who don't believe it. I mean, any new idea is resisted. It's a good thing in a way, because it means they have to pass some kind of test. You can't believe everything. And so when you're doing research, not just in parapsychology, but in anything else, if you come up with a result that's unexpected, it produces an immense amount of skepticism. I think you then may begin to doubt it yourself. You think, well, maybe I've done this wrong. And when you start doing the experiments, you no longer expect them to work in quite the same way. And I think what we have in some areas is competing morphic fields or belief systems. The power of a kind of skeptical belief system is quite strong, and it affects participants in experiments as well, and it affects the experimenters. On the other hand, the excitement about a new result is very strong too, which is why in some of the examples that were in that New Yorker article, people discover something new and it really works well and they're tremendously excited it's going to change the world. They have a kind of beginner's luck thing. And then they tell people about it. Oh, it doesn't really work. Let's see that work under other conditions. And, I bet it's not going to work under these conditions. It sort of dampens down. And so I think that's more a kind of competition of worldviews or belief systems. And since experimenters affect their experiments, it's called the experimenter effect, I think that this is one of the reasons for it. But there are other reasons too, and it's a complex phenomenon with no simple answer.
I think an important point here is in hospitals, certainly when we were young housemen, it was always recognized that as soon as a new drug came out, you always gave it immediately to your patients while it was still active and strong so that they get better, knowing that sooner or later, in fact, the effect would decline, to be withdrawn.
Hello. It seems to be normal human phenomenon, indeed need, that we should be certain about our beliefs. In fact, living successfully, we have to know what's what. But it seems to me that the more important the person, the more they need, the belief has to be certain to maintain the importance of the person. And so what I'm really wondering, is there anything that we can do about this?
Well, I don't think that beliefs have to be so certain, you see. I think they have to be certain for fundamentalists. Fundamentalists are people who need certainty, whether they're religious fundamentalists or scientific fundamentalists. But I think most people actually are perfectly capable of tolerating uncertainty. In courts of law, juries have to tolerate uncertainty. Did they do it or didn't they? And there's arguments both sides. People are being swayed as the case goes on. In politics, there are arguments and debates where there's no certainty about how to fix the economy. There may be people who think they know how, but no one would trust them if they thought they were certain about how to fix it. And in science too, I mean, people who are at the forefront of their fields are usually aware of the ambiguities and difficulties. The certainty gets greater the further you get away from the research frontier. You know, people who've got a smattering of popular science and have been to one or two skeptics in the pub sessions, you know, are extremely certain about the materialist worldview. If you talk to people actually in leading edge research in physics or cosmology or dark matter, they're much less certain, and they admit the uncertainties. So I don't think that certainty is essential. It may be essential for people who are carrying out crusades. I think for Richard Dawkins, certainty is absolutely essential. But, you know, and for religious fundamentalists, but even in the realm of religion, there are a great many people who are not certain. I'm an Anglican myself, and I go to church on a regular basis, and I've yet to meet a fanatical Anglican. In fact, doubt and uncertainty are in a way, I think, excessive within many branches of modern Christianity. So the only place I meet unswerving fanatical certainty is among materialists and militant atheists. And I mean, there are a few religious fundamentalists, but I don't come across them personally, but I mean, they certainly exist. So I don't think it's a necessary feature of the human condition. It may be a necessary feature of people getting up crusades and getting people to do things in a very highly motivated way. But for most of us, most of the time, we know that there are many uncertainties and ambiguities about every aspect of life.
Congratulations on the science delusion, which I greatly welcome, not only for its lucid exposition of what is wrong with the current practice of science, but also from a personal perspective of reassurance, which slightly conflicts with what you've just said. I was trained as a scientist, but never practiced as one. I did, however, adopt a scientific method when researching my current book on human evolution from the origin of the cosmos, which I began with a completely open mind, with no presuppositions of theism, deism, or materialism. What surprised me was to find many things that I'd assumed were firmly established scientific theories, if not fact, were in fact mathematical models based on beliefs unsupported by, and in many cases contradicted by, evidence. What I found shocking was the way in which anyone not subscribing to the current orthodoxy was treated. Reputable scientists in a particular field who had a different interpretation of the evidence were treated as heretics and couldn't get their papers published by journals that operated on a peer review system comprising what seemed to me bishops of orthodoxy. When I, as an outsider, asked questions about underlying assumptions or conflicting evidence, I was treated as an infidel. Several theoretical cosmologists responded to draft chapters I'd submitted for correction by accusing me of attacking science. Many neo-Darwinists, biologists, dismissed me as a closet creationist. But if they'd actually read what I'd written, they would have seen that's completely the opposite of the truth. So my question is, I was surprised and shocked by this. I mean, I can quote examples of reputable scientists who can't get peer reviewed, who can't get published, and so on. Do you find this shocking and surprising?
Well, not surprising. I find it, I mean, I've come across so many instances in so many fields of science. I think it's the normal way science works at the moment. And in the final chapter of my book called Scientific Futures, I try to deal with how we might be able to go about that, changing it. I think one of the problems is that science, in its myths of origin, scientists see themselves as heirs of Galileo, and in the kind of mythologized version of the Galileo story, they see Galileo standing for free inquiry against the dogmatic reactionary forces of the Christian Church, the Catholic Church, the Roman Inquisition, and so on. So they see science as this liberating thing from religious dogma. And I think what's happened is that the model that now science has become a kind of church. It's modeled itself not on actual churches, the Church of England, the Methodist Church, and so forth, the Roman Catholic, the Orthodox Church, all of which have many schools of thought, and all of which coexist with other denominations. It's modeled itself on the pre-Reformation Roman Church, where there's one truth that applies to the whole world, one system of authority. Like each country has its National Academy of Sciences, like a College of Cardinals, an authoritarian structure controlling the funding, the publication, and the teaching of science. So everything else in modern life is pluralistic. Religion's pluralistic. There are lots of them. If you don't like any of the Christian sects, you can become a Muslim. If you don't like the Sunnis, you can become a Shia. If you don't like any of them, you become an atheist, an agnostic, a secular humanist. If you don't like the Conservatives, you can be a Liberal Democrat, a Green, a Labour supporter. But if you don't like the establishment in science, there's nowhere else to go. And that is the problem. So I think we need a plurality of first of all, to recognize that science consists of sciences, not one thing, but there's a plurality of sciences, each with their own traditions. And secondly, I think we should try and introduce debates into science. There are very few debates in science. The reigning orthodoxy is the orthodoxy. Any dissenting view is treated as heresy, as you say. Scientists frequently use the word heresy, as if there's just one truth. And I think really science has to grow up. We need a kind of scientific reformation, and indeed an enlightenment of the Enlightenment. You know, we need to go beyond the way these things have got so dogmatic. And I think debates, discussions, dialogues are one way forward. Plural sources of funding are another. If there are many sources of funding with different aims and objectives, then it would introduce a kind of plurality into science. One of my own suggestions is that 1% of the national science budget paid for by taxpayers should be used to fund research that actually interests people who'd be asked for what they'd like to see research done on. If 1% of the medical budget was spent on research that interested members of the public, some of it might be spent on research on complementary and alternative medicine, for example. So I think there's many ways in which it needs to change, but I'm not at all surprised by your own experiences. I think they're utterly typical of the way science works in almost all its branches right now.
Rupert, do you think that the internet and internet journals are going to make a difference to this? Because information has become much more freely available and to some extent gets around the peer review stranglehold.
Well, you can put any information you like onto the internet, but the question is, will anyone read it or pay any attention? I mean, there are millions of people putting forward individualistic theories and views on the internet. But, you know, how many of us have time to read them all? What happens is that what actually impacts on most people is what's taken up by science educators, science journalists, and it's very, very selective what reaches the awareness of people outside the scientific area. So it's always filtered. The internet means you can have small subgroups of people working in the fringes, but that's where they'll stay unless there's some reform to the mainstream system.
Thank you. This will have to be the last question.
Rupert, hi. So just to say that a friend of mine brought me here and said to me that this lecture by you was going to change my world, and I have to say it really has. So to some extent I'm devouring everything you're saying, but also I have a question to put forward to you. So my instinct is that this deal that you did with your friend feels a little bit unfair to me, and I'd like to just put it forward to you in a different kind of way. You know, just looking at constants. Now, I happen to agree with you that constants are all wrong and need to be changed. And I feel so refreshed to hear someone with some kudos saying that. And it's wonderful. But they also form a path. You know, constants are there. And this is just an example. They're there to allow you to, they create a road for you to follow. So we wouldn't have telecom satellites if Newton hadn't come up with his wrong gravitational constant in the first place. They form a purpose. And I feel that the deal you did with your friend is slightly biased in your favor, because what he is doing is he's laying down a vision. He's laying down a vision which may be wrong, it may be right. And your side of the deal seems to me only contains what can't be done. And so you were very kind in giving him space to come back and bring it down to a worm or a newt or whatever it was. But I would recommend that maybe you go back into the deal with what will happen as opposed to what only won't. Because actually in doing that, you might be creating that truth.
Well, yes, okay, that's fair comment. Most of my scientific work is based on putting forward hypotheses and doing research. I'm usually in the position where I put forward, evidence for telephone telepathy, morphic resonance, memory effects in crystallization, and it's then either ignored, usually ignored, or attacked by skeptics, so-called. That's my usual position. It's actually the only time when I've ever been on the other side in this genome wager. So it's not typical of my general scientific approach. Normally I'm proactive and try to come up with new facts, theories, experiments, and so forth. The reason I think that it's not totally unfair is that all of us as taxpayers and many people as investors have been carrying out this wager for the last 30 years. They've carried out a wager where they've been told that this form of investment will lead to vast returns, that it will pay off in a huge way. Hundreds of billions altogether have been invested in this, and the returns on capital or investment have been pitifully small. So I think that the reason a bet is appropriate there is because that bet's going on a vast scale using our money. If people are on our behalf betting vast amounts of our money, either as investors or as taxpayers, on something that's very unlikely to work out, then it is of concern to everybody else. And I don't think it's unfair to call their bluff and actually say, well, put your money where your mouth is. It wasn't very much. I mean, half a case of Quinta di Vesuvio port pales into insignificance compared with the investments in biotechnology. But at least see what happens in a way with a defined timescale. Now, I'd be prepared to enter into lots of scientific bets, and actually I think betting would be a very good way forward. I've found that scientists who are prepared to put in grant proposals for tens of millions of public money, I've sometimes challenged them. I said, I bet you £100 that doesn't work out. And as soon as it's their own £100, their attitude changes enormously. So I think actually magazines like Nature, scientific journals, should have bookmakers actually running books on the prospect of different kinds of research and how they might turn out. And that would be a much better way of evaluating their prospects than expert committees who are usually biased in favor of the establishment point of view.
Well, that was an absolutely wonderful demonstration of Rupert's, not only his sense of humor, but his creativity. What I would like to suggest now is all those people who have reserved books come up. Where's Claudia? They're going to come up here or down there. They've got to go down to the end there. So if you've reserved a book, please go down to the end there and collect it. All of you who have not paid for your books, will you please remember to give your name so that we can trace you, and also the envelope, the address label, which will be given to you so you can send your money back. Again, let me remind you that if you want to learn about the network, we have our website, scimed.net, scimednet.org, and I'd recommend you to have a look at it. If any of you wanted to join and you can see the wonderful things we do, please ask Charlotte at the back. And those of you who are in London, you do not have to join the network to join and go to some of the wonderful groups which are talks which are held in London by Claudia over there, and there is in fact a list of the talks that are given. So let me just ask you all once again to thank, in my view, one of the most creative and provocative scientists, real scientists, that there is, and we have him in our country, and he's here tonight. Thank you. Rupert Sheldrake. And now there is drink at the back. I think you are signing.